question, I wanted to ask a question that is so common, and I really want like real unschoolers to answer it so that I'm not answering it for them, or when I'm answering it for you, I have what you said in my brain. Those of you who did not learn to read in school, how did you learn to read? And then particularly Aosha, like when you go on camping trips with adults who haven't been camping before, like people talk to me about reading as like the basics, and I'm like, well, Aosha can walk into the woods with like a piece of string and a rock and survive. Like, isn't that the basics? Or like, most people see that as like a basic. So I wondered if you have things that you see as the basics that you're like surprised when other people don't know, considering your like woodcrafty upbringing. So, but starting with reading, like, how did you learn to read?
I remember when I first learned how to read, it started with what were those? There was some books that we used to.
It was the Bob books or
yeah,
something.
Yeah, that's what it was. So I started with those, and it was just like kind of on my own usually, just kind of trying to read them, and some with the parents' help. And then I remember it just kind of like at some point just kind of clicked. Like I was just trying to read on my own as much as I could. And then I picked up like Magic Treehouse was the first books that I read. And I picked up one and I was like, I can read this. Like I don't really remember what the whole process was, honestly. It was just kind of like, I struggled with it for a while, and all of a sudden I was just like read the whole book, and then I just read all of them, you know, like it just sort of happened. So for me it was the biggest part of it was just sitting down and doing it. And having some guidance and stuff, but having those very simplified books that are designed for that was just like, and then just having the resources to just pick up a book and have my own time to work on it and to try to understand it and try to put the story together on my own. Yeah.
And to be read to aloud, like
okay, yeah.
so much, like that was such a huge part of our lives.
Yeah.
The vocabulary and the experience and being read to.
So yeah, that was my reading learning experience.
Alice?
Yes.
And how old were you, Aosha? Because people come and they're freaked out, like, my kid isn't reading and they're 7, and I'm like, chill, it's okay.
I honestly don't remember exactly. I know it was before Kaya. That's one thing I remember. I feel like it was like 7 by the time I could like fluently read books.
Yeah, you were a little bit before your brother, so yeah, okay,
yeah,
all right.
something like that. I mean, that's yeah.
No, totally.
Which is a little late for some people because it wasn't like drilled into me right away. But I didn't need to read everything before I was 7 anyway. So yeah.
I'm so excited about reading. I was a certified, elementary school teacher, K through 8, and like, how are we going to teach first graders to read? We're driving down the road, and the boys are like, can we play that ABC game? What does that say? What does that say? What does this say, Mommy? What does this say? So it's just like swimming. You just learn it. It's just such a natural process for most kids. I mean, we need to help guide them, but it really is a lot like swimming. It's like get in the water, you're experiencing it, you're learning just by seeing the words and being told, and
A brag about my brother a little bit more. He was always precocious, so I will say he learned how to read at the age of 3, because he really liked to read maps, because there was another dimension to them aside from just words, but also pictures. And I was on a different spectrum. I probably learned at like 5-ish, maybe earlier. I'm not sure. I was very into comic books. I read Harvey comics. So like Casper, like the super old ones that probably like my parents grew up with, like Wendy the Friendly Little Witch, and then like moved into more current comic books like Garfield and Zitz, and I read the comics in the newspaper when parents got newspapers, and that was a thing, because they had this other dimension to them besides from just words, but these pictures that illustrated the story very well. We have a chalkboard in my house, and there would always be like a word of the day where my parents would try and get me to spell it. So they just put like a word like elephant And like by the end of the day, they were like, "Do you know how to spell it?" And we're like, "Nah." And they're like, "Okay." I'm still god awful at spelling. Thank God for spell check. But as far as reading goes, oh, this is embarrassing. Well, not really. I love Harry Potter. And to this day, every single night when I go to sleep, I listen to Jim Dale on audiobook. And I did growing up, and I still do, and it's like sort of embarrassing, but like, come on, it's great. So yeah, audiobooks. I grew up with a lot of them, and there's all those just like, yeah, I don't know. Reading is not like, it's super important, but I think as far as like, you need to learn it at some point, and the sooner you do, the more you can explore as far as this. I mean, you can't understand everything that's been written unless you know how to read, but there's so much other stuff to explore that like there's no huge rush. There's other stuff to learn first. I don't know.
So if I can just kind of follow, and I'll be brief because I know there's another question too. It turns out that there's a fair amount of literature on people who learn to read outside of school experience. So sometimes we're talking about what we call precocious readers, people who learn before school age. Sometimes we're talking about people who are unschoolers, how do they do it? There's a fair amount of literature. There's some studies on this. They're all qualitative studies, so they just kind of like figure out these individuals how they do it. And there's a few themes, and Peter Gray has an article, I think, about like kids teach themselves to read, where he summarizes like what the lessons are. Number one, there is no single age at which people do it. That's kind of a myth that we've created through school. Like if you create a system where you learn to read in first grade, everyone's going to freak out, oh my God, my kid passed first grade, they're not learning to read. But that's kind of because school tells us that, and there's really no basis for it. The second thing is there's no one way that it happens. Some kids do it through like the osmosis process that you're talking about, where you're read to and probably like subconsciously you're linking up the word with other kids learn through like discovering kind of like phonics. Oh, that's A, and people say when there's A, so okay. Other people learn through a really deliberate process. Some people it's just kind of natural. I mean, those are the really two big rules. It's not a science. We constructed a science around it, but honestly, that's because school tells us that there's a science to it, and not a lot of basis for that. So, but we also live in a really hyper-literate society, and like anything, when kids find something they want to do that requires text, they'll figure out ways as long as there are resources. They'll figure out ways. If they want to do it, they'll do it. So, anyway, that's kind of my answer to that.
And Aosha, any startling basics that people don't know when you go in the woods and you're like,
At this point, nothing really surprises me when it comes to that, because I know that the way that I was raised and all those kind of things were just so different from everybody else. But I don't know. I mean, I think some of the biggest things for me was working with the Haw River Learning Celebration, which is this group of fourth graders that comes out to the Haw River for 3 weeks out of the year. Different schools that come out, and we teach them. And like some of the kids in fourth grade, which is like not incredibly young, but still pretty young, like they've never touched a river. Like they're like, can I touch this? Like literally asking me. Like they've never held a grasshopper. They've never seen a spider and not been like, I just want to kill it. Like their parents are just like, oh, you see a spider, you smack it with a piece of cardboard or whatever. It's like, so I think that's one of the bigger things that I've noticed in young people in this day and age is the fact that it's not commonplace for people to have experience and be like comfortable putting mud on their face. Like something like that is something that like, by the time I was 6 years old, I was routinely covering my entire body in mud. And like, just things like that I feel should be commonplace in everyone's lives, especially as a kid. That it just kind of shocks me when people don't know, or the parents haven't given their kids the resources to learn these things or to be okay with these things. So I think that's the biggest thing, is just looking at younger people, not necessarily adults, but younger people who just haven't been given the opportunity to experience these things that I experienced at a very young age and became very commonplace to me at a very young age. So that answers your question.
Can I answer that real quick? Because my experience of not understanding some like very commonplace thing, again, it goes back to me saying I was exposed to many ages. So I also
I agree, yeah.
I volunteered at the Haw River Festival. I worked at Schoolhouse of Wonder. I volunteered at One World Market on 9th Street for 8 hours a week. I volunteered at the Full Frame Documentary Film Festival every year. I volunteered at ADF every summer, like handing out programs and like interacting with adults and kids much older and younger than myself. And on the flip side, a lot of kids that I experienced when I went to high school, they pretty much grew up with the kids of not even like a year or two older or younger. They pretty much hang out with the kids in their grade. That's not always the case, but that's very common, is like your friends are exactly the same age as you, and that is who you know, and that's who you know how to interact with. And so a big thing that I think I was really surprised at, I thought was commonplace, was an ability to interact with people of all ages. Yeah, right? Yeah, that was like a shocker.
Yeah, I definitely second that. I mean, it's been an interesting experience in my life, just noticing that like people treat teacher age people like a different people.
Yeah.
It's like it's very compartmentalized sometimes, and not all kids are like that. But yeah, I mean, a lot of my best friends are 6-7 years older than me. I have friends that are